Hey guys, and welcome to your Chapter 26 to 28 test review. This will be my last test review for the year for your regular tests. I will not do one for your modern test because it's going to be an all-level test, and it should be easy. And for my class, it'll come from mainly from your study guide. So remember that, of course, as I'm doing this review, you are responsible for reading the textbook, and any questions that come from out of the textbook, you are responsible for knowing. So while this is a brief overview, this isn't an end all be all. As I was thinking about, these reviews that I've done, I've quickly gone through, each of the topics and talked briefly about each one of them, even though some of them aren't on the test. And as you prepare for the AP test, something to think about would be when I go back and watch some of these review videos, even though they're catered to the test, a lot of the information holds true in any amount of reviewing for the test. Now, there's all kinds of different, YouTube videos that you can watch, crash course videos. There's some by other APUSH teachers that are out there you could probably search. But, if you like the sound of my voice, then by all means, you ought to look at some of the other test reviews, especially if if you didn't do well on the Gilded Age. And I know a lot of y'all in my class didn't do well. You may want to go back and watch the review video and pick up on some things that you might have missed. But for this one, we're going to go from 1960 to 1988, from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan. And so, when it comes to John F. Kennedy, we talk a lot about what made him gravitate towards the American public and why the American public has kind of this love affection with John F. Kennedy. Good looking guy, supposedly had an affair with Marilyn Monroe. He was a family man. He was assassinated, and so a lot of people are kind of hung up on what happened. But we got to remember that all these presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan, they all had the same goal in mind, and that was to stop the spread of communism. And each of those presidents did those. And so for John F. Kennedy, even though he was president for a short time, he still had the idea of stopping the spread of communism through his not only his New Deal frontier with the Peace Corps, but then also with the Bay of Pigs invasion to try to stop Castro in Cuba, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then, of course, his famous speech at the Berlin Wall, where he gives his famous, how's it go? Where is it? I'll find it. Ich bin ein Berliner, which could have meant I am a jelly donut, but he was basically he was saying that I am a Berliner. And really, this is no different. He wasn't the only president to give a speech at the Berlin Wall. If you remember, just recently we talked about Ronald Reagan standing at the Brandenburg Gates, and you'll see it later in this presentation. And he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And so a big part of this test is about making connections from different time periods. So Kennedy at the Berlin Wall, Reagan at the Brandenburg Gates. If you remember going back to Harry Truman, he instituted his Truman Doctrine, which was to stop the spread of communism in countries in Europe. He wanted to bolster those non-communist countries with weapons. And so he who was trying to stop the spread of communism. So the goal was to contain it, all right, and to show opposition towards communism. Now, Bay of Pigs won't be on the test, but this is a attack or an attempted attempt to take over Cuba, but it was sniffed out by Castro, which led to his alliance with Khrushchev, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which for about 6 days, there was a tense notion that we might have been under a nuclear attack. His new tier program, you can stop and pause it at any time, but remember his goal was to put a man on the moon. We were losing the space race because of Sputnik. The Soviets were one step ahead, and he wanted to put a man on the moon, but he wasn't alive to see that happen. It happened in 1969. But you can look that he wanted to address poverty in America and provide poor Americans with jobs. He proposed tax cuts. He addressed the civil rights issues. But like I said, he wasn't alive long enough to see it through because of the the Kennedy assassination. Lincoln was also assassinated, but not on this test. All right. So for Lyndon B. Johnson, remember that he is two things are going on. One is his Great Society program, which is very similar to the New Deal program of FDR, and you should. I mean, we should be able to make comparisons of those two and how those link together. But then also was hit the stress of the Vietnam War when it hit its height, its escalation, and so his Great Society was the war on poverty. And so you can look at the poverty statistics and see that even though poverty wasn't necessarily solved, there are a lot of programs that were instituted, and y'all did that research in class. So here are all the different little Great Society programs that you need to know. Remember that its goal was to help the disadvantaged through the war on poverty, civil rights legislation. It's going to expand the power of the president, whether it was FDR in the New Deal or Lyndon B. Johnson in the Great Society. And he does this through these many 208 all total acts. Ranging from Medicare and Medicaid, which a lot of y'all should know, a lot of environmental protection. We're going to talk about the environment here in a little bit because you got several test questions about the environment. Here are some more of the highlights of his war on poverty, healthcare with Medicare and Medicaid, which led to Obamacare, education through the Elementary and Secondary Act, which provides federal funding towards state and local school districts. So thank the Elementary and Secondary Act while you're having to listen to this video for your test on Thursday. So where did the idea of the government intervening to improve social conditions? Well, you've got to go all the way back to the Progressive Movement. So if you go all the way back to the Progressive Movement when Theodore Roosevelt was president, you remember the 3 C's, and one of them was consumer protection, and one was conservation, and one was controlling the trust, and all those things were there to help the people that were in dire need. It's going to be taken over by Woodrow Wilson while he was president, and then it's going to trickle over into FDR, and then into Lyndon B. Johnson. All right, so make sure that you can make that connection. All right, so for the environment, all right, so it all started in 1962 with a book that was published by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring. She believed in her book that, and this goes with today as well. You know, you can connect this to Harvey if you wanted to. So because we are building so many subdivisions on the outer cities, it's virtually killing our ecology. All right. So, you know, one of the reasons why so many parts of Katy was damaged during Hurricane Harvey was because we are building subdivisions on land that was not necessarily made to have subdivisions built. It was part of a floodplain area that if the dams get backed up, Barker's Duck Dam or the one on Barker and Addicks, if they get backed up, they back into parts of Katy. And so building to the west of Houston was very damaging to our environment. And the same thing that Rachel Carson says, that the growth of suburbs is damaging to our ecology. And so as a result of this book and other movements like the Group Against the Smog and Pollution out of Pittsburgh, which you're going to see on your test, their goal was to provide laws to reduce pollution. All right, which is part of the Great Society. The Group Against Smog and Pollution, they wanted awareness of the abuses of the natural resources that we had. And remember, this is connected to the conservative movement, so that's why I've talked about connection to the conservatives. If you think about it, Theodore Roosevelt was a conservative, John Muir was a preservationist, but both of them wanted to protect the environment. So who would be against this? Who would be opposed to it? Well, it'd probably be corporate leaders or executives that are experiencing economic growth on behalf of the environment. Now, so you've got, and I can go back and show you if you remember. So part of Lincoln or LBJ's Great Society program is the Wilderness Act, the Endangered Species Act. Later, when we get to Nixon, he'll pass the Air Pollution Act, and that's a notion that Nixon had a little bit of liberal that was with him as well. So I think that's all on the environment as far as what you need to know. All right, so make sure you know about Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. All right, so in 1964, if you remember, LBJ runs a bit against Barry Goldwater, and if you remember the Daisy ad, and I tried to play a video just as a test, and I can't necessarily pull up the audio to the Daisy ad. And if I hit this, it takes me to a bad one. So if I were to type in, Daisy And let's see what pops up here. And I don't think you're going to hear the audio to it, but you may want to, on your own, you might want to pay attention to it. I could hear it in my earpiece, but I don't think it's going to play on your video. But remember, she does the counting. All right, so you're going to see this picture on the test, and so if you remember, they count down, and it's a scare tactic, right? So they count down, and then two, one, and there you see the explosion. So this is a fear, obviously, of nuclear attack, fear of nuclear attack, and you need to know that for your test. So that's going to be on your test. All right. So if you haven't seen that Daisy ad, go ahead and type it into Google and spend you a minute and take a look at it. All right. Make sure you know that he defeated Barry Goldwater in 1964. That's the test question. All right. Let's see what else. All right. So there are several questions on the Vietnam War. Do we remember why we're fighting in Vietnam to begin with? It's because of the containing communism, right? We're fighting communism, and there's some comparisons to the Vietnam War. So just some things to remember as far as the Korean War. Remember that China will eventually get involved in the Vietnam War. I'm sorry, in the Korean War, and in Vietnam, we're going to face. We're going to face the Vietnamese, but they have help from both the Chinese and from the USSR. If you remember, in Vietnam, we're going to fight this because of communist aggression, much like Korea. So that's the same there. The only difference really is that in Vietnam, you see where public opposition is going to turn against fighting in Vietnam, whereas Korea was not so much. And so there was a lot of debate over the merits and rationale of why we were in Vietnam, especially in the late 1960s. And a lot of this goes back to the invention of the television and how when people are come to face with what's going on halfway across the world, they're forced to deal with it. Not necessarily deal with it, but take action against it or take an opinion on it. And as the war wears on, public opinion is going to dwindle. Even Martin Luther King, you're going to see some stuff about Martin Luther King comparing kind of what's going on in the world with decolonization and nationalist movements going on around the world, and how the U.S. is kind of suppressing those things from happening, just like the concerns about inequality in America. So be able to make sure you're able to make that connection. Started with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions. Remember, that gave the power of Congress authorized the President Johnson to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, which Nixon will also take that, but he will send secret missions into Cambodia. He gets ridiculed for that, and because of that, we passed the War Powers Act of 1973, which will give power back to Congress in declaring. Approving any movement of troops. And remember that with all the secrets that were being held in Vietnam, and then of course in Cambodia, and then Watergate, you see this credibility gap where the people are not going to trust the president or the government for that matter. The Vietnam War will escalate during the late 1960s. It will force the resignation of Lyndon B. Johnson. He'll decide not to run for re-election in 1968. And here you kind of see some of the people that were, like a dove as peacekeeping. There's Martin Luther King, and you'll read some stuff on Martin Luther King on Thursday when you take the test. Remember that Vietnam is going to cause a big debate at home. And if you think about Vietnam and why we're over there, you can connect it to imperialism, where we contemplate whether or not we should be expanding our empire not only into the Western Hemisphere, into Latin America, but then also the Pacific, and think about the Philippines during the imperialist time. So there's another connection that you'll have to make on the test. Like I said, a lot of protests at home, a lot of music that reflects the times of Vietnam and the rejection of why we're in Vietnam, and you can see some of the iconic images that you see as a result of the Vietnam War. Here are some of the POWs returning home after being held hostage. Here's the numbers, Vietnam by the numbers. The government's going to tout on the fact that we killed up to 3 million Vietnamese, where we only lost 58,000. But when you see it on TV, people are not going to be very happy about that. Vietnam protests are going to happen all across the country, mainly on college campuses, which leads to a division at home. All right, and then in the midst of everything, you've got a space race going on where Kennedy is, makes the declaration that we're going to go to the moon, and that happens in 1969. Whether you believe it or not, it did happen. All right, the counterculture. Remember, these are this started in the in Levittown, where these teenagers are going to grow up as beatniks, kind of are cynical towards society, which is going to lead into the hippie movement. Some are going to go to college and create the Students for a Democratic Society, and you've already been tested on that, so you don't have to worry about that. And here's some stuff on the new left. Some of the revolts that happened in Colombia, the free speech movement at the University of California at Berkeley. Hippies are the counterculture. They're anti-establishment. They're against the middle class consumerist values, and they're anti-war. After Woodstock happens in 1969, a lot of them will have to join into the workforce in America. A lot of them will serve as your environmentalists and such. A lot of them will experiment in drugs, marijuana, and LSD, and also the sexual revolution happened in the 1960s. Here are some of the more famous music artists of the 1960s, and you did your little web questing class that you looked at some of the music, some of the famous films of the 1960s that reflected the times. Here's a list of them there for you, and television shows as well. So not a whole lot as far as pop culture going to be on your test. 1968 is an important year in U.S. history. Some would say it's a turning point, mainly because look at all the events that happened. Starting with the Tet Offensive on the Lunar New Year, all the way to when Nixon wins the election in 1968. But you can see the Robert Kennedy gets assassinated, Martin Luther King gets assassinated. The My Lai massacre happens on March 16th, but it's covered up by the government. Another reason why the people don't trust the government because of the credibility gap. Let's see. Riots are going to occur outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And then here you see in 1968, you see Richard Nixon's going to defeat both Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat, and then if you remember, George Wallace fought as ran as the American Independent, who was for segregation. Remember, he was the one that prevented trying to prevent segregation happening at the University of Alabama, as you would have saw in Forrest Gump. All right, so we looked at this on Monday, the difference in Republicans and Democrats. Make sure one thing that I did not mention in class, and hopefully I mention this tomorrow, I'm doing this one on Monday, that make sure you know that the John Birch Society is a group of radicals that are for the far right. So when we think about Republicans, you're thinking about the John Birch Society. Some of the highlights that you need to know for Republicans: they are for traditional family roles and families. They greatly oppose the Great Society because they see it as big government. They are pro Ronald Reagan. Okay, Reagan ran in 1980, and they're going to promote evangelical Christians to run in politics. And so people like Pat Robertson are going to hold public office. So we'll get more into that as we get into it. So make sure you know the difference in Republican and Democrats, and here's all the stuff that you can go over for that. All right. So for Richard Nixon is well known for his détente from a foreign policy standpoint. I'm trying to see if I have any. All right, yeah. So that's where Nixon gets a lot of credit as a president, as he's able to form an ease of relationship with both China and the Soviet Union, and they kind of play one off of each other. So remember that détente is a time for it's the easing of tension, and so he'll be the first U.S. president to recognize Communist China, and will visit there in 1972, which created a huge impact on the Soviet Union, who will do the same thing. And so if you notice, in 1972, we signed the SALT I treaty, which is a strategic arms limitation treaty, and this will be on your test. And when it comes to SALT I, this isn't the first time in our history that we've tried to make some peace, some sort of gesture to help reduce kind of the world tension between us and other countries. So, for example, like in the Washington Conference, we tried to, in 1921, I believe, we tried to reduce the number of battleships that each country possesses. Doesn't work. In 1928, we tried to pass the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where we try to outlaw war altogether. doesn't happen. And then you got the SALT I strategic arms limitation treaty, which we're trying to reduce the number of weapons that us and the Soviet Union possess. And then eventually we'll sign SALT II and the anti-ballistic missile treaty. So all these are all examples of trying to de-escalate or detente with these countries. All right. Nixon will also come up with a plan with slowly withdrawing from Vietnam. It was called Vietnamization. You can see all the different things that happened. Now, when the Pentagon Papers were released in 1971, it shows that the government was misleading the American people when it came to Vietnam. And so, if you go through our history and talk about ways that the government has not trusted or has misled the American people, it goes back to the Teapot Dome scandal while Warren G. Harding was president. You think about Vietnam. You think about the cover up of the My Lai massacre, the Pentagon Papers, where we were actually fighting in Cambodia when we shouldn't have been. You think about Watergate, which we're about to get into. You think about Monica Lewinsky's and Bill Clinton's affair. You even think about you can even think about the Iran-Contra affair with Ronald Reagan. So these are reasons why people do not trust the government, right, throughout their history. Now, when it comes to, here are the environmental policies, by the way. The Environmental Protection Agencies created the EPA, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act. Let's get to Watergate. All right. So y'all did the little lesson on Watergate. So just some things to remember about Watergate. Remember that in the end, it shows that the system works, that the Constitution works. Nixon would have been impeached. He should have gone to jail, but he was pardoned by Ford. But it shows that laws apply to everybody, all the way up to the president. We do know that the credibility gap is going to increase as a result. And here are all the different things that happened. It started with the committee to reelect the president, and they break into the national headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. It gets leaked to the press, and the press is eventually going to it's actually going to make the Washington Post, which leads to the notion that they have tapes on there, the United States versus Nixon Supreme Court case, which leads to the resignation. So the system does work. All right, so that leads to Gerald Ford, who becomes president, who will not be on the test. All right, so make sure you know who Betty Friedan is. Betty Friedan is the author of the book, The Feminine Mystique. All right, and basically what this is this book is about a rejection of women's roles in the suburbs. Remember, after the Rosie Riveter, many women are going to return to the suburbs, or move to the suburbs, and fulfill those traditional roles that women had during the 1950s. She is the organizer and creator of NOW, which is the National Organization for Women. And if we were going to make a connection, this is I believe this will be the third wave of feminism. And if you remember the first time around, it was with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott at Seneca Falls Convention, and their document was the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments at Seneca Falls, which was a Declaration of Independence for women. And so now you hear here's the National Organization for Women, led by Betty Friedan and the women that you see here, Gloria Steinem. Some women are going to make political gains. For example, Sandra Day O'Connor will become the first female to serve in the Supreme Court. She was a conservative. Geraldine Ferraro was a vice presidential candidate with Walter Mondale in 1984, and then of course Nancy Pelosi, who's the Speaker of the House today, but she was the first female Speaker of the House in 2006. Now we have the Equal Rights Amendment here, all right, that equality of rights under law shall be not denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Now, the name you see there, Phyllis Schlafly, is actually going to reject this notion of the Equal Rights Amendment, and you're going to see some stuff on her on the test. First of all, know that Phyllis Schlafly is a conservative. So as a conservative, she believes in traditional gender roles. She believes in maintaining the structure of the family. She is not for the separation of home and workplace for women, which is reflected going all the way back to the Lowell girls in the 1910s and the 1920s. Right, and so you'll see some stuff on Phyllis Schlafly. So make sure you know that she is going to be against that. All right, so I think we're starting to get towards the end here. Roe versus Wade was the is where the legalization of abortion through the or up until the first trimester, and this opens the debate of pro-choice versus pro-life. The election of 1976 is going to feature Jimmy Carter versus Gerald Ford, and we know that Carter will win. His biggest two biggest things was the Iran hostage crisis, which he couldn't solve, and of course the Malay speech where he calls Americans materialistic. And then here are some more other things. His biggest accomplishment was the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. Let's see what else. Oh, some 1970s television for you. Famous films in the 1970s. Some music of the 1970s. You can always pull up the PowerPoint and look at these if you wanted to. All right, and then we've been talking about the Reagan Revolution and the impact of Ronald Reagan. I'm trying to look to see if there's anything on the test regarding Reagan other than we need to know that he was a conservative. He believed in a deregulation of industry, and he wanted to reduce taxes, and that goes back to what he believes as far as Reaganomics. And so Reaganomics, he believes in cutting taxes so that companies could reinvest in their own company, expanding their company, and hiring more people. He wanted to deregulate oil and gas. He wanted to reduce banking regulations up to bolster the economy. And of course, you see some of the impact of Reaganomics and how it worked. He will win an election in 1984. We've already talked about this in class. We've talked about the difference in the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt. A couple years ago, the Sun Belt was actually one of the LEQs on the AP test. So make sure you know the impact of the Sun Belt. And if you don't know, the Sun Belt is going to stretch from California mainly to Florida, but the southern part where a lot of people from the north are moving south, right? And the Rust Belt is located here where a lot of the steel jobs are located. But of course, with people outsourcing and these plants are shutting down and unemployment is starting to grow in that area. Here are some of the ways that he combated communism, which you've been doing some stuff in class on that. The Iran-Contra affair, if you remember the American Dad cartoon that talked about how we illegally sold arms to the Iran and took the money and gave it over to the Contras in Nicaragua to fight the Sandinistas. Whether or not Reagan knew about it, that's open for debate. He does make the speech at Brandenburg Gate to tell when he tells Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall, which will signal towards the end of the Cold War in itself and the collapse of the Soviet regime. All right, here's some famous films and music of the 80s. Okay, some of my personal favorites. Yeah, and that is it. So hopefully this will help you on your test. If you have any questions, then feel free to. It'll have to be morning tutorials because I'm not available in the afternoon because of football. But let me check to make sure that all these things are. I think I presented everything to you. So good luck on your test. This will be your last AP style test for the year. So I know you're all excited about that, and you'll start gearing up for the AP test. Best of luck.